Welcome to the MRX Influencers Podcast, where you come for the insights, but stay for the good times. I'm Dan Fleetwood, and on this podcast, I chat with the best and brightest minds in the research space. On this episode, I chat with Jonathan Hawkins from Anthrolytics around digital empathy and predictive behavioral analytics. So without further ado, let's get right into the conversation.
Yeah!
Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
I love coming into a chair. Thanks, guys.
We are the ultimate woo team.
Yeah. Your company, Anthrolytics, you want to give a brief explanation on that and then sort of maybe what digital empathy is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a new company in a new category, really, in terms of digital empathy. We're focused on giving companies the data that they need to create empathetic experiences, marketing, communication strategies in an increasingly digital world. And I think this question about empathy is a really big one. It's very often used, obviously, in terms of leadership and employees, but ultimately, people are people. And we all want to be treated empathetically. Mm-hmm. And, I think really until, I've got an amazing team on board with, frankly, more PhDs there. I think I'm probably one of the few who doesn't have a PhD. So I do feel a bit dim sometimes, I have to say. But, they've created this amazing solution by really combining behavioral and data science to allow companies to predict the emotional response to events or sequences of events and linking that to the subsequent behavior that a customer is likely to take. Right. And of course, because you can now link emotions to behaviors and events, you can now link that to measurable outcomes such as, let's say, reduction in retention, increased revenue. So very much the traditional sort of metrics that every CX program, if you like, is trying to achieve. But of course, now we've been able to do it linked back to the individual behavior, which has a far stronger correlation than many other ways of doing this. And I think the important thing is with what the guys have come up with is that we're able to do this for every customer every day. So we're not reliant on somebody having contacted you or you having interacted with somebody. We're able to provide this emotional score on every customer. And that's what we mean when we talk about digital empathy and allowing organizations to operate a digital empathy program at scale. Because I think it's one thing when you think about empathy, and we tend to think that, look, I walk into the corner shop, the guy knows me and he's empathetic and so on and so forth. But right, you're a major bank with 60 million customers, right? Well, how do I create that at scale through digital? And so that's really what we're trying to solve at Anthrolytics.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. I understand that. What sort of, I guess, in terms of digital empathy, what are you measuring? You mentioned like interactions at certain transactions and things. So are you measuring like, okay, based on this transaction, they felt happy or whatever those emotions are. And then you're obviously predicting their future behavior based on previous. Can you give a brief explanation on how you guys are looking at that?
Sure, absolutely. And I think it's important to say at this point, look, there are lots of solutions on the market which will predict emotion. And that's kind of not the clever bit of what we're doing, right? There are speech technologies, there's NLP, NLU, there's a whole bunch of great companies who are doing that kind of work. And I think what we're doing is taking that to the next level. Okay, so in terms of what does a company need to do this? It's pretty much what any company of scale will have already. So they'll typically have surveys. I mean, certainly all the Question Pro clients will do, in the majority. Majority of major organizations have surveys with verbatims. And so what we do is we use that as the mechanism to start building the emotional models and the emotional personae. And now we can say, okay, well, Crystal experienced this, said this about it, and we can start building out emotional models of people like Crystal, people like Dan. Then we build that as a model. We then use operational data so that we don't have to rely on you having contacted us and rely on you having left another verbatim. We use the operational data around the event or sequence of events to predict what you're likely to do next. And I think it's really interesting that, I think people have been talking about this kind of stuff for years. And I think a lot of companies have tried it in a way that really tries to, identify what exact emotion is Dan feeling at the moment, or Jonathan or Crystal. It's virtually impossible to do, right? I mean, you can, with the best one in the world, none of us, as good as we are, can predict exactly what you're feeling now. However, what we can do is sacrifice a little bit of accuracy for usability. And I think if you start taking that approach to it from a machine learning perspective, I cease to have to worry about the segment of one, and I start being able to use a segment of people that I can bucket into likely behavioral groups. So that's how we think about it. So it's very much data that everybody's got, right? It's verbatims, it's operational data, transactional data. And as I say, we build that on an emotional score for everyone, and that's how you start running the data play out at scale.
Okay, that makes sense. So each person essentially in their database or CRM or whatever for a company gets a certain score, and then based on that, what sort of actions are you doing differently based on different scores, or what are you recommending that companies do?
Yeah, so there's a couple of examples, Dan, and I think sort of use cases, if you like. I mean, one of the keys is that you're trying to not interrupt your customer, right? I mean, we're all sick of getting a variety of, sales pitches and what have you at times when we either don't like a brand, we don't care, or frankly, we're just ambivalent, which honestly is most of us. We pretty much right? I mean,
the worst.
Exactly, all right? I mean, really, and I think this is one of the other key things. I'll get back to the use case in a minute, but, I think you start thinking about how consumers have changed. And, I think a lot of companies are really focused on the operational efficiency side. And I think consumers now think of that as a hygiene factor. Look, I don't give my cell phone provider any credit because I can make a call, right? And because they get my bill right. I do give them credit for interacting with me in a way that doesn't interrupt how I feel and make sure that they're appropriate in their communications with me.
True.
So I think there's a couple of things. One is, when you start thinking about customer journeys as an example, if you can now start understanding the correlation between an event and sequences of events along that journey with behavior, you're now able to start building out journeys which can drive your strategic outcomes, but in a way that provides more choice to the consumer, right? So rather than trying to force fit people, you're now saying, well, how do I make people feel? And how do I make people how do I want to make people feel? And you can start building empathetic experiences around that. And then obviously, once you've done that, start measuring, make adjustments, your usual processes for any form of sort of change management program. The other sort of primary use case is, of course, marketing. And I think there's an awful lot of talk nowadays around, customer experience in marketing, empathetic marketing. And, certainly when we ran the original POC on this, we frankly saw some results. It's what encouraged me, honestly, to get involved in it. And I'm so passionate about it. But we ran it at a very major organization, with a customer base in the tens of millions. So hence, I feel very at liberty to use the word at scale.
As you should.
So I'm pretty confident on that front, albeit being the cynical guy who's been in the industry for too long. But, but really what they were able to do is start segmenting customers in a different way. So you've got your traditional methods of segmentation, but now you start adding in a layer of what we call empographic segmentation. So segmenting with empathy and building that into your existing models. You can now start saying, okay, well, Dan and Jonathan may well be in exactly the same segment. And so traditionally we would just pump marketing material at Dan and Jonathan equally. Right. So what we can do is we can say, well, actually, based on the empographic segmentation, we know that Dan is actually far more receptive to buying, and Jonathan's very ambivalent, which is exactly what this organization did. And so consequently, what they saw was that when they did this, they pushed sales literature effectively to try and upsell people to only those people who were receptive. On A/B testing, they saw an increase in revenue of 20%, and of course a reduction in marketing spend by 40%, because of course you're actually only marketing to a far smaller segment. So it was quite a remarkable outcome. And The other thing that sort of came out of it was this group of people who were not really, they wouldn't be your traditional suspects for churn, if you like. If you looked at your churn model, these were not really people who were kind of displaying the traditional things. Churn. They were ambivalent. They never responded to marketing material or any form of interaction with the organization.
Right.
But the predictions that we ran said, well, actually, these people in the next few months are quite likely to start exhibiting behaviors of churn. What they did was started to put in loyalty campaigns really based around, right, this is why the brand is valuable to you, right? We're not just a commodity provider, we're valuable. This is how we can help you in life moments. And then two interesting things happened. One was that this group of people started to become more economically active. And whilst I don't have any measures on that, it was very prevalent, and the organization said to us very clearly that, look, we're seeing very much an uptick in terms of activity from this group of people who have previously been ambivalent based on the loyalty marketing campaigns we put in place. But also, as a byproduct of those campaigns, the churn in that group of people also reduced by 10%. So whether you're looking at growth as an organization, whether you're looking at reduction in churn as a metric, and I think the important thing here is that, we give organizations the ability to really focus on customer lifetime value through both growth and churn reduction. So that's where we're focused.
Interesting. So one question I had, obviously, sort of, detractors, promoters, kind of comes into the play here. So you're saying that even people that maybe identify as a promoter under this model that you have would be identified as, hey, they're likely, they would show up in the churn portion, you think? Or,
no.
Or I think traditionally it'd be like, hey, you're a detractor, you're probably likely to leave, right? But maybe it sounds like what you're saying is even there's people that are like, promoters or even passives that maybe would show up in this model and then you market to them differently. Is that fair?
Let's put it in those terms and think about it like this. Okay, so I can very generally, you're taking me back to my SAP metrics days here, Dan. Right?
Sorry, I know.
NPS. But think about it like this. I can be generally a promoter of a brand, right? Yeah. And I can have a bad experience with you. And I'm still broadly going to be a promoter of that brand. It's not enough to dent my loyalty to you. Mm-hmm. However, I could have experienced a couple of events in the last 2 months that probably left a slightly bad taste in my mouth. So look, am I going to start not using you completely? Absolutely not. However, if you send me something to try and upsell me at that point, right, I'm not going to buy, right? Yeah. And I almost need a kind of arm around the shoulder to say, look, we've got you back here. We know you're a promoter, and this is why we're still a valuable brand to you. So that's how you would deal with me empathetically in that instance. Okay. Now, the group of people that I'm talking about there in terms of that churn reduction example that I gave, if you put it in NPS terms, would be probably people on the cusp of being a detractor and a passive. Mm-hmm. And so actually moving people on that cusp is actually a very valuable thing to do because, honestly, in most of the organizations that we'll be dealing with and do deal with, they're typically commoditized organizations with a focus on CLTV, financial services, telco, etc.
Right.
And so, generally I'm pretty ambivalent about it, as I say, but if I can just nudge them ever so slightly, and this is where a lot of the behavioral science comes into play. Mm-hmm. And I think very, very interesting in terms of sort of UX experience design, how do you start thinking about behavioral nudges and what have you to move people along? And I wouldn't profess to be an expert in that side of the world at all, but it's, it starts to get fascinating. But equally, I also think people can think of it in quite a scary manner, right? It's like, look at your face, Crystal. I know. But I think the key here is, look, we're actually trying to make the world a better place because what we're trying to say is, look, we're giving brands the ability to not bother you when you don't want to be bothered, right? And when you are receptive to something, to give you more choice, to give you better options. And so I think there's this whole ethical question. We talk a lot about sort of, ethics in terms of this kind of predictive behavioral analytics. Right. And, and look, the vast majority of brands, I think there may be some kind of horrible sub-segment of brands somewhere that I probably wouldn't want to do business with. But, big global brands understand ethics. They understand how to, how they should behave. And as I say, the ethos is to use this to increase choice for consumers, not to, have some kind of, dark art that moves them from one point to another.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you see this being like a CX program, that traditional, or is this a digital empathy program that they would implement?
I have a secondary question to that too.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Crystal.
Would you also, I'm thinking of use cases like Southwest, where their CS team and their social team are some of the they are at the top of the priority matrix at Southwest because of their engagement on Twitter and Facebook and in those social networks. But so much of that is more anecdotal empathy because it's based on the sales rep or the CST person. How do you then put those anecdotal modeling into how do you model those interactions into digital empathy?
Right. Okay. So I think they're almost two different things, Crystal, because I think you're absolutely right. The empathy on that kind of one-to-one basis, and the Southwest Social team is awesome, right? I mean, as are many of them around the world.
I don't fly them anymore, but I still enjoy their brand.
I love Southwest. It's my airline of choice for hopping across the states. But I think, is an individual empathetic, and are their social teams empathetic? Absolutely, and they do a great job of that. And I think they obviously screen and train very well for that. So I think there's this sort of question of how do you train people to be empathetic? And you see an awful lot of that in contact centers, right? It's a very, very big way there. Mm-hmm. And so we're not. We don't provide companies with training around empathy. We don't at this point in our evolution, but frankly, we're a startup, so roll forward 5 years, who knows what we'll be doing, right? But at this point in our evolution, we're not training people around empathy, because I think there are lots of organizations who do that probably far better than I could ever do it or my team could. What we do, however, do is give the organization, so in those examples, the social teams and the CS teams, the knowledge around what people care about. What is. So let me give you an example, Crystal. Perhaps you could envisage an instance whereby I've got an emotional score on Crystal. As Crystal calls into the contact center, we know Crystal is either happy and receptive to buying something, perhaps needs to be routed to a more empathetic agent. So it starts to get very granular based on the emotional score around you.
Yeah.
Now, does that then just we talk about CX programs and we talk about CST teams and we talk about social teams, and it really seems like it more needs to be a holistic approach to the consumer journey than being marketing's going to score them this, and then they're going to get handed off here, and then they're going to get handed off here.
You're absolutely right, and I think that it's a far more sort of philosophical discussion about the sort of future of CX, right? Because look, you're absolutely right. I mean, CX, whether we like it or not, is a broken industry, and I think that there are. Yeah, but it's an amazing industry. But I think people have kind of, in some respects, forgotten what they're there for. We're there to provide and organize our companies around what is great for the clients. And I think our clients expect an organization. Certainly, you think about what we've all been through with the pandemic, the socio-political events of the last few years. Our expectations have increased dramatically on organizations, and we want to do business with organizations who have, a social conscience, who look after their entire ecosystem of stakeholders, not just the shareholder. And I think that's where the disconnect of CX comes, Crystal, because companies haven't quite caught up with that yet. And that's why, look, frankly, I could be ahead of the market, because I think we give companies a lot of data to enable them to start thinking more holistically around it. But, I think that a lot of CX programs, certainly the contact center side of it, is very focused on operational efficiency versus really understanding what does a client want. And so I think there's a disconnect because things have moved so fast over the last 12, 18 months, and I think consumer thinking has changed so dramatically. I mean, you look at all the surveys. I mean, I think something like coming up 90% of people say that empathy is the most important factor in loyalty. Yeah. Yet organizations are trying to improve their operational efficiency. And so I think part of it is speed. And when you're dealing with big companies, it's hard to turn that tank around, right?
Mm-hmm. So that's you see this as a like digital empathy program or platform that someone would implement at a company. Is that how you look at it, Jonathan?
Yeah, the way I'm thinking of it is I think of this more as sort of back-end system because it does have multiple uses, right? And I think that me coming in and saying, look, here's another login and a bit of desktop real estate you need to give up for an empathy score is probably not going to be well received. But I do think that people have invested very, very heavily in terms of the MarTech stack, CRM, CDPs, obviously VOC platforms like yourself. Yep. And what I see us being able to do is ingest data from those types of platforms that are already there, transform it, add another layer of detail, and then push it back into the VOC platforms in order to drive additional value from the investments you've already made. So I certainly don't see us as either competitive to any of these platforms. I see us very much as, adding value, another layer of value, and allowing you to start to do very different things with it. Again, opens up that world of, is it a program? And I think ultimately they will be. I think at this point in its evolution, it's probably too early to say, Dan, but a lot of the stuff working on around the sort of methodology and, how do you build out a program, I think is very relevant. And I think it's something that, we need to develop as an organization and as a category as we build out. Right.
It makes sense. It sounds like it's very complementary to anything that a company is already doing, right? Like
absolutely. And because I think there is great tech out there, and I think and there are a couple of missing gaps, and so we're trying to just plug the gap.
Got it. Makes sense. Well, hey, Jonathan, I think that's a great spot to end it today.
No, thanks for inviting me. Very kind of you. Take care of yourself.
All right. Bye. Thanks, Jonathan. Nice. That's a whole new ball game there, Crystal. New concept.
I know. I also felt so called out. There's people who could use this for nefarious.
I knew where your mind was going, though. Thanks so much for listening to the MRX Influencers podcast. If you want more information about Question Pro, go to questionpro.com. If you want to follow me, feel free to do so on LinkedIn or Twitter. Until next time, we'll see you later.